is changing very quickly, but there's so many great virtual events now that bookstores are hosting that you can kind of tune in from anywhere.
It's funny, yeah, because authors seem so accessible now. You know, there's some
Yeah.
authors that would be a big deal to go see them, and then suddenly you can just be in a chat with them. So this has been, I've actually, as a writer, been kind of, it's like a hobby now, is to join these Zoom calls. I mean, I've been on some because my book just came out, but also I just pop into as many as I can. They're wonderful. So I'm so happy to be here, Stephen. And I thought I'd just start out just saying a little bit about how you and I met, because it was like one of the last pre-COVID days.
Oh,
But yeah, Julia Claiborne Johnson, who's on the call, she's the author of Be Frank with Me. She knew that I was going to be in Palm Springs in February, shortly before I was going on a pre-tour in Los Angeles. And she said, "Oh, you've got to meet Stephen Rowley." And so he and I got together at a restaurant with Byron, your partner, who has a fantastic book coming out in July called A Star is
yeah.
Born. We could talk about that some more too. But it was such a nice way to meet you. And Stephen was impeccably dressed, and we had drinks. And one of the things I loved about talking with Stephen is he said, you know, as writers, this has really stuck with me. But he said, as writers, you're going to meet a lot of writers, and you just can't read everybody's work. So let's just have a deal. And you said something to the effect of, we don't have to read each other's books. It's okay. We can still just be friends.
Yeah, I call it the pact of non-aggression. You don't have to read mine. I don't have to be. We could just be friends, and the world will go on. The irony of that is, since I've read 2 books of yours since then, one that's published, one that will be out next year. I know. So you know, who knows? It's good in theory, I guess.
Yeah, but I was dying to read your book after I met you, because, and I had a feeling from, you know, of course, like, you don't want to think that the author is the character and so on, but just knowing your humor and your warmth, I had a feeling that the books would be like that. And so both of us have this unusual experience where we have read each other's books backwards. So I read Guncle, which you guys are in for a treat if you get the paperback edition of The Editor, because there's an excerpt from Guncle. Oh, good. I was glad you were showing the new cover. I want to talk about the cover. But there's an excerpt from your new book, and you can talk about that too, which I think is so great. And then I had just written a book, and so we exchanged our newest books. And then Stephen said, you know, which order should I read it in? And I said, we'll read newest, and then we'll go backwards. And that's what I did with your book, because then I read The Editor shortly before this so that we could talk about it. So it's fun to see the progression, and it must be really thrilling for you to have had your sophomore book, and then now it's in paperback, and you've got another book in the queue. And this is a book about, The Editor is a book about writing and being a writer. So one of my first questions for you, Stephen, is, like, do you feel like you're a writer now? Like, do you feel like you've earned your chops? Because I know that when I was a beginning writer, especially, it would feel funny to say, oh, I'm a writer. But what's your relationship now with being a writer?
I love that question, because I was asked it recently on a blog, on the Author's Answer blog, which is great if you know, people want to check that out. Great way to hear from a lot of authors that you know and love. But the question was about this sort of imposter syndrome, and I said, oh yeah, you know, I feel like an imposter all the time, you know, all this stuff. But in the past few weeks, that my feelings on the subject has actually changed, because I don't think, you know, I think, you know, I hear, you know, there's a famous thing about, so women will look at a job posting and be overqualified, but think they're not qualified, but a man will look at them and be way underqualified, but not hesitate to apply. And, you know, I don't think Norman Mailer ever has had imposter syndrome or anything. So I'm going to stop saying I have imposter syndrome. I'm going on my 3rd book. I do feel like a writer, but it's something I apologize for. I used to say it, you know, early on, I'm a writer, but I hold down a day job, and I want everyone to stop doing that, because, you know, 90%, 95%, who knows, of writers also supplement their income doing something else. It doesn't take away from your art, from your credibility, from your ability. You know, as a writer, if you write, you're a writer, and I want to start leading by example on that. So I'm going to say, with book 3 coming out next year, I'm going to start calling myself a writer and not apologizing for it.
That's awesome. You know, I feel like there's so much meta happening right now with writing a book about an editor and a character who wants to become a writer, and talking about your own trajectory as a writer. I just, for people who might not have read The Editor yet, or are newly acquainted with your work, do you mind just telling us a little bit about your first book, Lily and the Octopus, and then The Editor, and also about Guncle, just really briefly, so people have a sense of like what the topics are of these 3 books?
Yeah, sure. So my first book was called Lily and the Octopus, and it was, I used to try to distance myself a little bit from this, but there's no denying it now. It was a very autobiographical fiction about a time that I felt sort of stuck in my life that coincided with my aging dachshund getting a brain tumor, which in the book I've swapped out a brain tumor for a small octopus. So that the narrator of this book thinks that his dog has a small, eight-legged octopus stuck to its head, and weird, yes, but what I was imagining with the book was really about attachment and how difficult it can be to let go. But that's a kind of a strange metaphor, which fortunately many people followed me on. But it was a deeply personal book, and because it was strange, I never thought it would find a publisher, let alone an audience. But through a strange twist of fate, it did land with Simon & Schuster. It became a national bestseller. It was translated in 19 languages. There's a movie being developed, and so all these sort of deeply personal things that I had put into Lily that I never thought anybody would read were suddenly widely available for anyone who plunked down the cover price. I did change the names to protect the innocent, but there are some names are difficult to disguise, like Mom comes to mind. Somehow people crack that code, but fortunately, it was a very rewarding experience for me, but I knew I had escaped relatively unscathed. So when it came time for a follow-up, I had sort of was interested in writing about what happened to me, about a character who has written autobiographical fiction, and how that sort of spirals out of his control, and what the consequences might be. And the actual events of my life were not interesting enough to sustain a novel per se. So I was looking for that catalyst, for my story, for my take on this, and that was Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, who is the eponymous editor. I used to like the idea of people coming to the book not knowing that, but here she is on the cover, on the paperback cover now. So there's no hiding that fact anymore. So The Editor is a story about a young writer who has a deeply, candidly autobiographical novel about his mother, and what happens when that novel is picked up for publication by perhaps the most famous editor working at the time. The book takes place in the early 1990s. And how he's sort of caught between his own flawed mother and this sort of idealized version of America's mother in Jacqueline Onassis. And then the Guncle, which there's 2 sneak peek chapters, 2 preview chapters at the end of the paperback, will be out next year, in spring of 2021, which is kind of an Uncle Mame story. For anyone listening who doesn't know what a guncle is, it's sort of a term that's having a cultural moment, but it is a gay uncle, and it's often an uncle to young children who doesn't have their own children, and is therefore able to sort of dote on them in a slightly magical, heightened way. So that'll be out in spring of next year.
Yeah, I'm so excited for it. It was such a treat to be able to get a sneak peek, and you guys are lucky you get a couple of chapters of it. And the whole book, it's interesting. I think we were talking earlier about feeling like a writer, and I think that your readers would recognize in any of these books that it's a Stephen Rowley book. That it's definitely got your characteristic humor, also a lot of pathos, a lot of family issues. I was very moved by it. And it's hard to strike that balance, I think, between being moved by something and also making them laugh. So one thing I wanted to ask you about that I was really struck by in The Editor is I'm really interested in, one of my favorite kinds of book to read is literature of witness, where you have a character who's witnessing other very enigmatic characters. You know, I'm thinking of like the Book of Common Prayer, for example, and or Sophie's Choice. And a lot of times what struck me with your book that I thought you'd do that's very interesting is when you have a character who's so big, who's larger than life, like Jacqueline Onassis, you would think that the narrator would necessarily need to shrink away from that and become more of an observer and just kind of be like a lens into that world. But you don't do that with this book. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why I think it's such a major accomplishment. You still manage to kind of see Jacqueline Onassis, but also get the narrator's story. And the narrator becomes, James Smale becomes very interesting, what his trajectory is. Did you find it hard? I kept thinking in it as I was reading, it must have been really hard to know where and when to insert Jackie and how much to insert, because when I read those sections with Jackie, I'm dying to hear what she's about to say next. But then I'm also dying to find out what's going to happen with James. And is this book going to make it? And is this partnership going to last? So I wonder if you could talk about that really difficult, fine balancing act that you just really did perfectly, I think.
Oh, thank you so much. I think, you know, my agent joked with me once that my brand was sort of a high concept bait and switch. So dog and octopus, but the book is not really about a dog and an octopus. It's about, you know, a man who's stuck in his life and how the obstacles that we think are in our way are sometimes either greatly exaggerated or made up entirely. You know, and it was this, you know, it's Jackie Onassis, but surprise, she's not the lead character here. She's much more of a supporting character, and the real story is a love story between a mother and a son. And so I like, you know, coming up with a concept and then not hammering it, you know, too hard. It's really it's easy to say, it's easy to articulate, but it's harder to do in practice. And in fact, there was much more Jackie material written that's on the cutting room floor, as it were. Because I think, you know, my instinct is to overwrite something and then sort of sculpt it and sculpt the right version of it. And that's like really, you know, chipping away the parts that either give away too much or are sort of overwritten in a way, which is easy to do, or it's easy for me to do. But I think, you know, there's a lightness, hopefully, to my books that I really strive for, and that comes with balancing a lot of these sort of tear-jerking moments with humor and light dialogue, and hopefully that comes through.
Yeah, I thought it was really amazing the way you did that. And I was interested too in how Jackie O and the mother become parallel in terms of the weight that they have. It's just, I almost imagine these characters like as if they're on a scale. And when you're writing them, you're so careful in calibrating how much they're on the page and how not. So I think, you know, for writers out there, this would be a book to read to learn how to do that, because it's just so interesting to see how you manage that story. And then one other thing I was really interested in as a writer myself and thinking about my own book that just came out, and how the ending is so hard. And you have a character and I don't want you to give any spoilers away, obviously, but you have a character who's trying to figure out the ending. But I thought, I was curious when I was reading, did you know as you were writing what the ending was going to be, or did you write into it? Did you know how this character was going to find his ending? And then I guess I'm also interested in like how you know when you've got the right ending, like what happens, because there's kind of a magic that happens when you strike that right note in the ending.
Yeah. It's such a great question, and it is kind of a meta question, you know, for this book particular, because it is about a writer trying to find the exact right ending for his book. Fortunately, he has in his back pocket Jacqueline Onassis sort of whispering, you know, and guiding him along. It's harder to do. You know, writing is a very, or certainly can be a very solitary occupation. So it's hard, you know, on a journey where you really are by yourself. You know, Jackie sort of jokingly references Homer, this sort of Homeric journey that he's taking to find, you know, to define home. But these are really, intense journeys, as is writing a book. And I tend to know when I start out, I have a strong sense at the beginning. I have generally a strong sense of what's coming at the very end, but I don't like to know so much. I don't over outline the sort of middle of the book, because then it becomes, many writers do, and it's great, and it works for them. But for me, anything that makes it feel like work, like if I know what's going to happen, it's harder for me to get my butt in that chair and pound out 1,500 words or whatever in that day. I sort of I don't look as forward to work as much. But if I don't know what's going to happen and I sit down at the computer and there's room to surprise me or myself, then the work seems more exciting to me. And the ending can sometimes change, and sometimes you don't quite see it. In my early drafts of The Editor, I had gone a couple pages more from where the book ends now. And it's just one day, it just sort of magically became clear that no, I had come to a crescendo, and everything after that started to take away from what I'd accomplished. So sometimes it's not, until it's all laid out in front of you, sometimes it's difficult to see.
Do you feel like the ending, though, is like figuring out what this book is about? Because sometimes you don't know. I felt like that when I was working on my last book. Like I had a whole story and I sent it to my editor and I said, here it is, but I don't know what it's about. And we had to have a conversation about that, and then when I revised it and simplified the story, then all of a sudden it seemed to, like, I knew what it was about then, and then I could end it. Did you know what your story was about when you were writing The Editor the whole time? Or did the real meaning, the universal truth of your story, did it kind of hit you later on?
No, it hit me later on. Fortunately, I had something really flashy up front that I could distract people with. I could just say, oh, Jackie Onassis, and people would be, oh, that sounds really interesting. But the book's not about Jackie Onassis. That was a nice cover, though, to buy me time to figure out what the book actually was about. And it is really, a young man coming into his own, and what is our purpose in life? What do we truly believe? Is the art that we want to create, is it more important is adulthood saying what we want to say to the world, even if there are consequences, or is it taking other people's feelings into consideration first and maybe holding back our worldview a little bit? And it's an interesting and ongoing struggle.
It really is, when you write a book, and kudos to you for going through this and writing such personal books, you just wave yourself out there like a flag, and I think it's interesting too, because it seems like the kind of fame that a writer has is different than the kind of fame that like a Jackie O has, where she's known by everyone. I love that scene in Martha's Vineyard. I don't think I'm giving away too much, where they start hearing like music that's we didn't start the fire. Like everywhere this guy goes, it's Jackie O. But it seems like when you're a writer, people spend so much time reading your book and they get involved with it, yet you're kind of separate from it. You could be the most famous writer in America and still walk through an airport and no one would know who you are. So it's.
I like that. I mean, having written about fame in part in The Editor, I kind of like that. That I can, do a book event or whatnot, and some people are interested in coming to see me. Like, that feels like a great privilege, but also to maintain my privacy when I walk out of that bookstore. People know who I am because I'm the one standing up front in a bookstore. But you're right. In an airport, it's and sometimes that's very humbling. If you have 100 people come to see you, and then you go back to the hotel and they don't have a room for you, or what, you're like, well, wait a minute, I was just being cheered on by. But I think that's the perfect combination. I would be horrified to give up too much privacy, and I think that affects our work, our ability to what we do, because writers are inherently observers. And if we couldn't observe without changing the dynamic around us, I think that would be very difficult. I think it would have been difficult for Jackie to be a writer, a fiction writer.
Yeah, it's so hard too for people to not think that they're in your book, or that, that they, even if you don't write about them, they might see themselves in your book. So yeah, how did you write Jackie O's character? Like, how did you get her voice? Did you just
Well,
watch
yeah,
it?
I want to say, just remind people, the editor, the true autobiographical book is Lily and the Octopus. The editor is much more of a novel, and it was inspired by having written autobiographical fiction. So people shouldn't look too hard for themselves in the editor. I'm saying that in case anyone from my family is listening. That is not my family. But yeah, Jackie's that was a huge challenge, and the only way to approach it was with an incredible amount of respect, because I do think the world of her, more so now than even when I started this project. But as one of the world's most famous women, this part of her life was incredibly private, and rightly so. She had sublimated so much of herself to these two marriages, and when she stepped out from underneath the shadow of these two men, she was done with the spotlight. She was not eager to be the center of attention, and she put her nose down and went to work and had a very prolific 15-year career as an editor, where she edited about 100 titles. So this is a big part of her life, and yet it's not something that we think about as the first, top 5 things we think about when we remember her. Because this was a lesser known part of her life, I felt I had a little bit more freedom. And it wasn't, people weren't going to be like, oh, that doesn't sound right, or that's not how I pictured it, because a lot of people don't know about this time in her life. Having said that, there's some incredible, I read so many biographies about her, but there are 2 in particular, a great book, including one called Reading Jackie by Bill Kuhn. If anyone wants to read, who reads the editor, wants to know more, there is a biography just of her time in editing. Again, that's Reading Jackie. So I started with there. I had a very supportive publisher who helped put me in touch with some of her coworkers, who were generous in sharing their memories of working with her. Hearing from a writer who she edited, and mostly people were very, very eager to talk to her. I had one woman who said that she, the reason her working relationship with Jackie was so successful was that she never spoke about her outside the office, and she was going to continue to honor that. And now it's more than 25 years after her passing. So, but that in itself can be very telling. And then, because this book opens in 1992, I read the books that she had edited around that time, just to try to recreate what manuscripts were on her desk, like what else she was working on, what thoughts might be in the forefront of her mind, what her interests were at that time in her life, and then try to create dialogue for her using that information.
What are some books that she edited that we might know?
Well, there's, she's known for, she did do a book on First Ladies. She did do, there were a lot of coffee table and art books. She was very interested in dance too, and ballet. So the nonfiction books she did are often very high gloss. She was very interested in the look of a book and the quality of, right down to the quality of the paper and whatnot. She did also edit fiction. It wasn't, so this is not that far of a stretch. It wasn't primarily what she was known for, but she did work with a few young writers. She worked with Bill Moyers on his books, particularly in spirituality, all kinds of stuff, a book on Russian czars. It ran the gamut as you might imagine, a woman with her life experience, her interests were as broad and varied as her life was.
Yeah, you really captured that, I think, that sense of how she's internalized her experiences and applies that to the editing process, which I thought was really interesting. And another thing I wanted to ask you about, I think, because both of our books address this, but I thought it was really interesting, the chapters where the character goes home to Ithaca. And this idea of returning home, and even the Homeric structure that you have, and Ithaca as the place that he goes home to. And what is it about his journey that going home helps him discover who he is? I'm really interested actually in a lot of fiction of movement, how much people move around physically in
Yeah.
fiction, what kind of distances they can go, and what that kind of travel and distance does for a character. And I wondered how him going back to Ithaca kind of opened up that story for you and allowed him to kind of burrow deeper into his own narrative.
Yeah, again, not coincidence that I chose Ithaca. There is some sort of Greek mythology, that sort of Homeric journey, like it was seeping its way in. But yeah, and just how quickly the world has changed. Also, I had to stop and think. 1992. Okay, he lived in New York. He wouldn't have a car. How did we get back and forth? There were no, taxis and not lifts, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, for physical movement. But yeah, there is always something about, particularly for, I left home to go to college, and I never, never really fully returned. Um, I think you always carry a slight guilt, or you leave behind a shadow of yourself that's maybe living another version of your life if you hadn't struck it out on your own in a very specific way. So that's sort of what if and what is happening without your presence. I think, we exist in families, but our vision of our family is how it kind of revolves around us a lot of the time. And so there's immense curiosity about how that family continues when you're not, when it's, say, not revolving around you. And I always think that that's where you get to know who people really are, when you stop looking at them in terms of how they relate to you specifically, not just genetically relate, but how they exist around you, and then who they are without you is something that I find very interesting, particularly with parents. And both of our stories are family, family stories. But I've always been guilty often of, and I think a lot of people are, of thinking that our parents are kind of born as fully functional adults on the same day that we're born, and they didn't have childhoods and heartbreaks and adolescences, and hopes and dreams of their own. And that's, I think when a young, a young adult sort of, that occurs to them for the first time, that really affects them and changes how they see not only their family but the world.
That's fascinating. I'm actually thinking about Gunkel when you talk about that, about who we are when we're not around our families. And I think sometimes there's feelings of guilt for not being more present in people's lives, yet sometimes you need to leave in order.
Survival. Yeah. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's tough, but then there's a lot of guilt often for not staying and not being around, particularly when hard work falls on somebody else. If there's a sibling left behind to deal with an aging parent who maybe felt that was their role, and maybe they would have liked to have their life turn out differently. So yeah, there's you and I both like to write about that tension and family dynamic.
And then you raise that tension by having the character write about his family in a very public way and spill the dirt on his mom with Jacqueline Onassis Kennedy, or Jacqueline Kennedy
Yeah.
Onassis.
Yeah, which which is no spoiler alert here, quite a betrayal to his mother, who they had sort of grown up idolizing, the Kennedys. And so just the idea that he would expose his mother for being perhaps less than perfect to a woman that everyone had idolized as sort of an image of the perfect wife and the perfect mother.
It's interesting. That reminds me of that quote that you and I were emailing about, that I love so much, from Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, about the certainty of the past is more comforting. You sent the exact words to me. Do you remember the exact words?
Yeah, there's a moment where she says to James, the lead character, and this stemmed from a moment that I happen to do this. I tend to romanticize or be nostalgic for times in my life where I know I wasn't happy. And I don't understand why that is. I know I'm happier now, but I still think of a time when I remember being unhappy and having a fondness for it. And I couldn't figure out why that was. And it was something I wanted to explore in the book. But Jackie has a line where she says, I think we long more for the certainty of the past than the goodness of it. And this was a woman who, for better or for worse, was very much defined by her past. You know, no one could look at her and not think of Dallas and not think of that day and not think of grief. You know, I still think there are people, you know, certainly my parents' age, who never understood why she would marry someone like Aristotle Onassis, and you know, it was clear to me she didn't want to be a professional widow. She didn't want to be cast in that role of grieving for the rest of her life. So the past is something, and it's hard. You know, that was something that she lived with on steroids, because the entire country was kind of nostalgic sometimes for that Camelot and that era and that sheen that time had, before that innocence was shattered. So not only when you're nostalgic for something, for a different time in your life, but when the whole country is nostalgic for you to be nostalgic about that, you know, I can't imagine that pressure.
And the irony is that while she's encouraging James to look at his past and really mine it and interrogate it and make sense of it, she's, you know, the past for her is kind of off limits. When he talks to her, it almost feels like every time they have a conversation, and I just love the dialogue. I think, you know, again, like for writers, I'd read your book just to learn how you write dialogue, because it's so they're not on the nose, but it's on the money. It's great. But I love how, you know, every time he tries to ask her a question, you get a sense like, whoa, should you have done that? There's a lot of boundaries in your book. It's really interesting. And I think that's part of the tension that comes from it, is just a sense that when characters cross a boundary, as a reader, you know what that boundary is. You know, like as far as fidelity goes, as far as conversations with Jacqueline Onassis, with the mother, there's just all these like boundaries that become visible, and then they get burst through, and then you look to see how they get repaired. It's so interesting how you did that.
Yeah, well, you know, part of it, particularly with Jackie herself, you know, in writing and in using her as a character, you know, there is a sort of wish fulfillment element. You know, you can imagine what it would be like to sit in a room with her and all the things you would want to ask her, but you know, to make the Jackie character true to who Jacqueline Onassis was, you know, and I can do all the research in the world, and I can talk to all the people who knew her, but there's still going to be a percentage of this depiction that's my invention. You know, it's impossible to know everything. But I think one thing you could know for sure is that you were very clear of where the boundaries were with her, and she would not tolerate people towing over the line, and that's certainly something that my research and talking to people who knew her would say was all that. You know, she brought all that history into a room with her. You couldn't not think about it, but also that it was very clear where the line was drawn. And so it's interesting, you know, using a historical figure in fiction, and there's certainly, you know, a whole genre of doing it. You know, I'm fascinated to read Curtis Sittenfeld's book next. It's sitting on my nightstand, Rodham. You know, there you have speculative fiction about someone, coincidentally, also a first lady, who's still alive. You know, I can't imagine the pressure of that. Fortunately, having a little distance helped here, but you do want to be true to who that person was. And there were times when writing this where I would think, oh, the story would just be so much, you know, the story would be better if Jackie would just do this, or God, I could really move this scene along if she would say that, and you know she wouldn't do that, or you know she wouldn't say that. You know, you have to be very respectful of that. Sometimes that's a good thing. You know, when we write fiction, we're often creating worlds or characters or whatnot out of whole cloth. You know, sometimes having no parameters is just as daunting as having restrictions in a certain way. So sometimes you can use those restrictions to your comfort, but you have to respect them.
And just imagine poor Jacqueline Onassis Kennedy with all these socially awkward writers who usually don't see other people, you know, and suddenly having to, you know, acknowledge all these social graces.
Yeah. It is interesting, but you know, I don't think that she was someone who felt so. You know, despite her experience in the world and the polish with which she presented herself, there was still part of her that I think always felt a little, you know, shy and quiet. too. She would be much more comfortable with books sometimes than with people herself. So, but you know, and it was an interesting part of her job because she was so, you know, she was such a unique person to have in the office. You know, there was a time when Michael Jackson was contracted to do his sort of a book about himself, an autobiography per se, although it ended up having a lot of pictures. But he wouldn't turn in the manuscript and wouldn't turn in the manuscript. And no one at the publisher could get Michael to do anything. And they drafted Jackie, you know, and flew her out to sort of stand over him and make sure he done, because she was the only one who was sort of bigger than Michael Jackson that he would listen to. And so, despite the fact that that was not her preferred role in her job, that sometimes she couldn't help but be drafted for it.
I think that would make a great novel. Just like
Yeah.
if you're looking for a sequel.
Yeah.
We're gonna open up for questions in just a minute. I just wanted to take an opportunity to plug Byron, your partner's book coming out, Speaking of Fame. He used to be the assistant for Carrie Fisher, whom some of you may have heard of. And his yeah, so it's a fictional account, but it's called The Star Is Born. So he's also a debut writer, which I loved it that we were both kind of going through this journey together. But it must have been interesting for you both to talk about how to write about a very famous character in both of your work. Did you guys have a lot of conversations about that while Byron was working?
We were working at different times. I had this book written before he really started to sit down and do his. So Byron Lane, his novel, A Star Is Born, is out July 28th, so in just a little bit less than a month. And he wasn't writing anything about Carrie, but a character who's very Carrie-like. So, you know, that takes off some of the restraints that we talked about before, you know. And that was one thing that my editor, Sally Kim at Putnam, whom I adore, really pushed me on in writing this book. Like, why does it have to be Jacqueline Onassis? Why not another famous high-powered editor? Why not Nan Talese or someone? Why
myself?
Yeah, why not? Yeah, why not a fictional former first lady? You know, and because then you have a little more freedom. But one thing she pushed me on is, if you're going to do Jacqueline Onassis, it should be clear by the end of the book why she was the one editor who really made sense for James. And hopefully by the end of the book, it is clear. So Byron's challenges were a little bit different, and sometimes I would envy his taking a complete fictional take on a person, but. He loved Carrie and has an enormous amount of respect for her and misses her greatly to this day. So he wasn't going to run anywhere to dishonor her. But parallel challenges, but different also.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm super excited for his book, and I'm excited for Gunkel. And I know it's really fun to hear from people who are on the call. And one of the great things about these Zoom calls is it's so easy to be present, to ask questions. Yeah. And so I think we're going to turn it over. Kelsey, you can talk about how you want to handle it with people either raising their hand or just unmuting themselves, but I'll let you take over with moderating the questions. But it's so great to see so many people here, and it's so fun to talk about your book. I love it, and I hope everyone buys it from Chevalier's.
Oh, thank you. And I'm a huge fan of I have your book sitting right here too, The Second Home. I loved it. It made me nostalgic for New England too, because you know, a section of my book takes place on Martha's Vineyard, yours Cape Cod. And I grew up in Maine, so you know, it's certainly New England summers. I've been thinking about those a lot lately.
I have too. I can't go there.
Yeah, I can't go either. Who knows when we'll be back? But man, I'd love some fried clams or some lobster or the ice cream that we get. Oh man.
But speaking of Homer, like, I'm in East Troy, so at least I'm like,
you can't get away. You can't get away from Greek mythology.
So great. Well, I hope you guys have some questions, so I'm gonna toss it over.
Yeah, if you could, at the bottom of your screen, you can either click the button that says raise hand, and that'll let me know and I can unmute you. If you're on video, you can just wave your arm, or if you want to cautiously unmute yourself and pose your question or put it in the chat, that's also totally cool. Is anyone brave enough to start?
I have a question, so if no one else has one, I can jump
Oh,
in.
I think we've got Barb.
Yay.
Okay.
Hi. Hi, Stephen. Thanks so much for doing this. I got your book was recommended to me a couple months ago by a friend, and at first I was very taken by the fact that he was writing a book called The Quarantine.
Yeah.
His home order had come down in Los Angeles. But I actually listened to the book, which was phenomenal. Michael Urie was the reader for anyone else who might have listened to it. And he did a phenomenal job. And I just wondered if there was any story behind, did you pick him? Was he chosen for you? And his Jackie impression is phenomenal as well.
Oh, good. Well, thank you very much, Barbara. I appreciate that. The audiobook is really fantastic. Michael Urie, who some of you may remember from Ugly Betty, he does a lot of Broadway. Did a lot of Broadway. I miss live performance so much, and I can't wait till we can have that back again. But he also narrated the Lily and the Octopus audiobook, and I gave him the challenge in that of doing there was a talking dog in that he sort of had to master. So I thought, oh God, I've already put him through the ringer. Jacqueline Onassis is going to be a challenge. He sort of famously did a play called Buyer and Cellar. Cellar spelled like basement. It ran for a while in LA and New York, and I think it was a great performance, his version of it on PBS, where he, and this is true, this much is true, Barbara Streisand in the basement of her house has built a shopping mall that's just for her to shop. She stocks it herself, so she knows the stores will have everything she likes and just her size, but she can sort of pretend to shop. And so this play, Buyer and Cellar, by the great Jonathan Tollins, presupposes that someone works in that basement, and then he's just sitting there for most of the day, most days where she doesn't come to shop, and then all of a sudden has to scramble to life when she comes down as the customer. So I thought if he could do Barbara, he could maybe do Jackie. He was so kind. He invited me to see him on Broadway. He started a revival of Torch Song trilogy, which was the revival was just called Torch Song, but came up to his dressing room afterwards and we talked about the book, and he could not have been more generous or excited for the challenge. So I think the world of him.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and by the way, the book, James's book, the book within the book that he's working on with Jackie is called The Quarantine, which now seems eerily prophetic. But anyway, bizarre. Anyone else brave enough to come forward?
While we're waiting, I have a quick question.
Yeah, please.
I didn't realize I'm such a newbie debut writer, I didn't realize between the hardcover and the soft cover that it could change so much, the design. And yeah. I wondered, can you tell us about that? How they changed the cover and what you thought of the paperback cover? And I know you said that they weren't sure how much they wanted to say that it was Jacqueline Onassis.
Yeah, that for this novel in particular, that was always the challenge, right? As an artist, I would love for every reader to come at this blind, and to have Jacqueline Onassis walk into the room for the reader at the same, exact same moment that she does for James, and that they could be just as taken and surprised as he is, because he's woefully unprepared for their first meeting. Now, the realities of publishing is that that's no way to market a book, and there's always that struggle, like how much to give away, how much of a hook to give away. And how much you want readers to know going in. Now, ultimately, that was our best sales tool, probably. But the hardcover did have a much softer approach. It was her desk with a manuscript and her signature sunglasses sitting on just hinting at Jackie. Whereas now it seems, a year and a half later, the cat's kind of out of the bag. people know this as sort of the Jackie book, so we might as well lean into it a little bit more, and hopefully attract a new audience who really that would be a selling point for them. So
What did you think when you saw it? The
oh,
paperback.
I really love it. I really love it. This is I wish I had the hardcover here too. We could do a side by side, but I love it. I love the colors. Yeah, it's there we go. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's great online too. I think it really pops on a screen.
Yeah, and it's like, well, what an unusual time we're at, where a lot of bookstores are closed or they're open just for curbside pickup or what. I mean, we don't have the ability to browse at the moment in the same way that we normally would. So, and now when a lot of books are bought online anyway, or as ebooks or something, the idea of how we think about covers changes, because it's got to look good in a thumbnail. It's got to look good, it's got to, the colors seem to be eye-catching in a way, and they can't be too busy that when you shrink them down to have online that it looks muddy. So yeah, the cover design is ever changing, and as the needs of the consumer are.
That's fascinating. Thanks. Anyone else have questions?
I'm having a vodka soda with a splash of cranberry, which I drink often, but for anyone who knows, this drink is called a Rose Kennedy, is the name of the cocktail.
We should be having Cape Codders.
We should be having Cape Cod. Yeah, we really should. Close. It's close. More cranberry juice. Yeah.
Or the daiquiri.
Or the yeah. If there are aspiring writers tuned in right now, I just want to say, if you ever write a sort of theme cocktail into your book, make sure it's one that you like, because you will be served this cocktail at every stop along the way. People will want to see you drink that cocktail. Assuming
COVID's actually over someday.
Yeah. It will be. It has to be. It has to be.
Yeah.
And alcohol is an antiseptic, anyways.
Yeah. This is a very different kind of book launch for you.
Yeah, it's yeah, roll with the punches.
Yeah, sounds great. Anyone else?
I actually have a question, if no one else does,
Yeah.
just about writing during a pandemic and how that's affected both of your styles and productivity. If you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, Christy, do you want to jump in on that first?
Sure. Well, I mean, I was on deadline, so I had a 2-book contract, and my second book was due. And I actually felt a little bit like Stephen's character a lot. It was kind of fresh, reading your book right after I had finished my book. But I was really, really happy that I had something to focus on, because I had to get it done. I was on deadline, and I felt very fearful that if I botched this, I'm just out of publishing for the rest of my life. And I think it was so hard at first to concentrate, because I was just reading the news a lot and feeling that kind of existential dread that I think a lot of people, well, everyone has. Yeah. But I was really happy to be able to lock myself away. And I actually had to physically go to a different space and just write and get the book done. But then I think it was actually kind of hard when I finished the book, because I felt a little adrift. I felt like sad I didn't have, as much as I would bemoan like, oh, I gotta get this done. And I was really happy with it. But then just feeling like, well, what now? What do I work on? So I'm just starting to get back into that place. But it's kind of hard to finish a big project and then move on to the next one.
Yeah, finishing it, I was sort of in the same place, whereas I was on deadline for the Gonkel. I had a few ancillary projects that I was working on. Been weirdly productive up until this point, and I think part of it, I mentioned earlier, it's a very solitary job at times, and so my challenge often is I get so easily distracted, or I want to know what everybody else is doing, or the sort of the fear of missing out, and so knowing that no one was doing anything during this time, and I wasn't missing out on much, really helps keep the blinders on and keep me focused for a bit. We've now each turned in a new book, and I don't know if you find that's true, but like it's very daunting to think about starting something new right now, and knowing what you might want to say in a world that's rapidly changing, and there's so much there's so much scary things happening, but so much good, this sort of fight for a more just world and trying to imagine what the world might be like in 3 years when a book beyond what we have coming out next year would come out, and what you want to say about that world. I'm finding it challenging. And so it's really hard time to start something new.
It's so great to hear you say that. And I don't want to read all books about COVID. Like when this is done, and I'm imagining all the writers everywhere going, oh, this would be such a great idea because so many storylines are going to be inspired.
Well, we both write about families, so if you pack those families in together tightly for a long period of time and ramp up the pressure, it's hard not to think about COVID is something to write about, but
Yeah, in my book, it's set, originally it was going to be set, the present day storyline was going to be in 2020, in the spring of 2020. Mm-hmm. So I emailed my editor when I was working on it and I said, what do you think I should do? Should I change it to 2019? Should I write it like it's 2020 and things are normal and just pretend like people don't know COVID? Or do I address the COVID situation and try to write around that? And she said, the one thing to keep in mind about writing about the COVID situation is you have a long timeline between when you finish your book and when it gets published, and nobody knows what's going to happen. Everything's going to change. So you have to, it's really kind of dangerous. And if you write it 2020 and it's normal, you're going to have readers kind of in the back of their mind thinking, but there was COVID. So I changed it to 2019, which I think a lot of writers are struggling with what to do with their storylines right now.
Yeah, it's, all of our works in progress could feel like historical fiction by the time they come out, because that's how rapidly the world is spinning forward, even though it feels like we're absolutely stuck and not moving at the moment. It's also hard when there's so many big and stressful news stories too, because being at Rage 11 all the time, which is sadly where I am much of the time, with frustration with the leadership and what's happening to our country. It's not a great place to create from anger always. I mean, it can be a good motivator, but it's difficult for me. So, but I do get a kick out of so many people now living the writer lifestyle. Everyone's sort of working from home. Do I need to wear pants today? I don't know. Should I have a fourth cup of coffee or make that a first glass of wine?
Yeah.
Writers have been doing that forever.
But you can't be a writer lifestyle with everybody home all the time.
No, that is difficult. I live with one other writer and a dog, so at least they kind of understand. But yeah, people who suddenly have the kids at home with them, or a husband who has to do loud conference calls all day, or so, that's definitely something. Those are the challenges.
Yeah, and leaf blowers and lawn mowers.
All that.
Yeah.
Great.
Any other?
2 questions. One came in through the chat, and Beth wants to know what both of you are reading right now.
Oh, great. Stephen, why don't you answer first?
Oh, good question. Well, we each have the privilege often of, being able to read things that aren't out yet or will be out next year. And that's a great joy of the job, but also I love it when I have a pocket of time where I know that I can pick up just for the joy of it, just read a review of a book or see someone else reading it, or a book blogger or Instagrammer, and be like, and just pick it up because it just speaks to me. And I've got a couple of those on my bedside right now. One I mentioned is going to be Curtis Sittenfeld's Rodham. There's a book out right now called Dear Edward, which I haven't read yet, but I'm dying to read. I just finished Christie's book and loved it a couple weeks ago. And then I've been doing a few events with writers. So I just read Ellen Hildebrand's 28 Summers because we had a chat last week. So, and a combination of things that maybe will be out next year. How about you?
Well, I finished Julia Claiborne Johnson's book that's coming out in January, called Better Luck Next Time, which was so much fun to read. It's set on a divorce ranch in the 1920s, and I didn't even know that was such the thing in Nevada, where you have to stay there for 6 weeks in order to treat.
People write that down for either winter or very early spring, but better luck next time.
Yeah, it's hilarious. And another book that I'm reading that I've read, but in my writing group, a writer named Lauren Fox, who wrote Still Life with Husband and Days of Awe, she just finished a book called Send for Me, which is it's a departure from her other work. It's a little more, I don't want to say serious because she writes more commercial fiction, but it's the most beautiful book. She's on a sentence level. It's just breathtaking. So I'm really excited about that book as well. And I'm also reading J. Ryan Stradle's new book, which he's working on. And I think that comes out next year. But so those are three that I've been super lucky to read. On the 15th of July, I'm in conversation with Lily King. And
oh, yeah,
so,
writers and artists.
yeah, so it's such a bummer because if my tour actually happened, we were supposed to be in an event together, and I was like, oh, my event with Lily King.
Yeah.
So, but I have Writers and Lovers. I started it, but I haven't gotten very far because I've been doing so many other things. Yeah. And I'm trying to read more writers of color right now. So a book that I was introduced to that I've heard really great things about is Remembrance by Rita Woods. I met her at an event and she was absolutely incredible. And also, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name. Kawhi Strong Washburn, Something in the Time of Sharks. I met him when I was at Winter Institute, which is like a bookseller conference, and that's been getting rave reviews, and he's super nice. So that's another book that's on my stack.
Yeah, I'll give a shout out to Colson Whitehead's The Nickel Boys. Also, is out in paperback today, I believe. So you look for that at your bookseller as well, because that's really phenomenal.
You know, there's so many great books, and somebody said something that really struck me that, you know, with TVs and movies not being able to be made as much, all the new culture is going to be in books. You know, that's where all the new culture's coming from. So I think it's so great that people are reading now more, meeting new writers. And I'm so excited about the lineup of the new books coming out because they're so good and it's so fun to be able to get a sneak preview of it. So lots of
we often look to writers to sort of contextualize where we are, and you know, these are certainly interesting times. So I'm very excited to see the literature that will come out of this.
I'm excited and scared.
Yeah.
Okay,
and there was one other question too?
Yes, we've got one. It's from Linda.
This isn't about the book, but I do plan on reading it because this discussion has been so interesting. And to that point, I just wanted to thank Chevaliers for having these wonderful Zoom conversations with authors. This is the second one I've listened to, and I really enjoy them. So thank you, Chevaliers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I always, you know, before when I could attend in person, and now there's so many great events online, you know, particularly if anybody has interest in writing, these are, you know, kind of sometimes can be like an interesting, you know, like MFA class. Yeah, I always learn something. I always learn something listening to one of these, and I love them. And also, indeed, thank you, Chevaliers. Be kind to your independent booksellers. You know, people are wanting books right now, and that is a good thing. And our independent bookstores are so important to us and to our communities. They, however, are working under very difficult circumstances, and people want their books now, and I get it. And there's another, you know, some of us that shall remain nameless, that can get you a book overnight, but that's not how your independent store should work. You know, invest that money in your community, be patient. Particularly, there's some wonderful books right now that speak to the moment and this anti-racist movement, but many of them had to go back to press, and it's great that book clubs are reading them all now and whatnot, and they're finding an audience that they deserve, but it's not your bookseller's fault if they can't get it to you in 5 minutes. So be kind to your booksellers, everybody. They're the nicest people you'll ever meet.
truly.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Stephen and Christina, for being here. This was lovely. You can get their books. You can email us, or you can get them on Bookshop. We also are going to be doing an event with Byron, just to plug his book one last time.
Oh, fantastic.
So look for that coming soon.
I did not know this. So good.
And have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Cheers.
Bye.